Part 2, The System. Chapter 8, Rural Life, Why They Won't Stay Down on the Farm. Villages, 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 with graveyards, as if all Russia converged on them. You must know, after all, that the motherland is not the city where I lived festively, but these hamlets in which our grandfathers strolled, with simple crosses on their Russian graves. Konstantin Simonov. Vasily Poshinkov is a rare man for the Soviet system. His job is to promote private enterprise. As I entered his second-story office in a building almost as large as Madison Square Garden, he rose from his desk, stout and prim, wearing a white smock over his suit like a druggist. For a long hour we talked about budgets and profits, 10-ton trucks for rent, warehouse space, and laboratory inspections, about procedures for renting space and uniforms, setting prices, and providing rooms in his dormitory hostel for people who come from Moldavia, Central Asia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Byelorussia, and sometimes Lithuania and Latvia to do business in Moscow. Then we toured the premises. Poshinkov is manager of Cheremishky Farmers Market, one of 30 in Moscow, one of 8,000 in the Soviet Union, where peasants can legally bring billions of rubles worth of produce from their modest private vegetable gardens, or slaughter their calves, chickens, and rabbits, and sell these wares on the free market with a style of come hither commence unlike the rest of the Soviet economy. We found the farmers' market a godsend, and so did many Russian families. Sometimes housewives balked at prices that came close to rivaling room service at the Waldorf, lettuce jumping from 30 cents a pound in summer to $1.50 in November, before disappearing altogether. Cauliflower at $2.50 a head in winter, sweet pears from the southern Ukraine at nearly 50 cents apiece, and roses from Georgia at $1.35 a stem in January. But the quality is better, the selection far wider than in state stores, and the Russian housewife succumbs to the flattery of coaxing and catcalls to aromas of ripening produce laid out for her to inspect, and to competition for her favor and a purse. "Come over here, Doshka, little daughter," a white-haired grandmother clucked at Anne one afternoon, using one of those folksy Russian endearments to entice her to sample jugs of thick, tawny honey. "Taste and see how good and sweet it is, little mother," she coaxed. "Let the little one have some." And the peasant babushka offered a lick of honey on a wooden popsicle stick to Anne and Leslie, our 3-year-old, as she bragged about the freshness of dripping honeycombs just taken from the hive. Let the browsing shopper hesitate by one vendor, and the competing chorus begins. Here, an unshaven peasant missing some front teeth offers skinned rabbit. There, a roly-poly Russian shows off farm-fresh eggs and earthy hens. An old woman, head wound in scarves like a mummy, offers a hunk of tworg, sweetened homemade cottage cheese on waxed paper, or a sample of smetana, sour cream from a white enamel bucket. A swarthy, flat-capped Georgian will carve the skin off a pear, eyeing the shopper craftily, and then extend a succulent sliver on his knife. In the far corner, women in rough country clothes beckon you toward dried mushrooms dangling on strings like necklaces of corks. The peasant woman water down their wares constantly so that the long stone counters are lined with glistening mounds of cucumbers, red beets, and radishes, or piles of fat, stubby carrots that resemble the peasant fingers that tend them. But surprisingly sweet, the pungent tang of dill quickens the nostrils. A hungry shopper can tide herself over to the next meal. Meandering among the stalls at the central market, or the one at Sheramushki, sampling not only honey and cream cheese, but little spoonfuls of vinegary sour cabbage, bites of dill pickle still dripping with brine from the barrel, a nibble of pomegranate, or little handfuls of pistachios and small purple grapes from Samarkand. But the country folk are weary of Muscovites trying to make too much of a good thing. All right now, a candy vendor will caution. How about a kilo? Are you buying today or not? The private plots that produce these goods are small and mostly farmed, part-time, but the volume of their output is so enormous and essential to the Soviet economy that the nation's 250 million people could not be fed without it. Since that is an ideological sore point, the regime is loath to publicize the performance of this private sector, preferring instead to trumpet the heroic achievements of socialized agriculture. But one unusual article in March 75 revealed that 27% of the total value of Soviet farm output, about 32.5 billion worth a year, comes from private plots that occupy less than 1% of the nation's agricultural lands, about 20 million acres. At that rate, private plots are roughly 40 times as efficient as land worked collectively. In hard crop-by-crop terms, the 1973 Soviet Economic Yearbook showed that in terms of value, 62% of the nation's potatoes, 32% of other fruits and vegetables, more than 47% of the eggs, and 34% of the meat and milk in the homeland of communism came from the private entrepreneurs of the countryside, who number about 25 million strong. One explanation is that the big crops are the ones farmed collectively, mainly grain and cotton, and another is that farmers get better prices for produce marketed privately than through the state. A third reason for these staggering statistics is that roughly half of what farmers produce on their private plots goes to feed themselves and neighbors without reaching the marketplace. But it is also clear that peasants farm their own plots much more intensively than they do collective land. Ultimately, the communist ideal is to have this last embarrassing but necessary vestige of private enterprise wither away, away as industrialized state farming grows in scale and output. Nikita Khrushchev, in spite of rural roots, pursued the end vigorously and earned the enmity of the peasantry. He cut the size of private plots to a maximum of half an acre and made life difficult for the farm market trade. I was told by Russian friends that Ukrainian peasants became so irate that they stopped selling eggs as food and made paint out of them. Egg whites make a very durable paint, a Moscow painter commented to me. Under Brezhnev, things have improved. The maximum plot went back up to an acre, and measures were taken to improve farm market operations. Soviet figures show the private farm output grew nearly 15% from 66 to 73. Although the state sector grew even faster, it is obvious that the centuries-old habit of personal farming will die hard among Russian peasantry. Even under serfdom, serfs had their own plots to work when the lord's needs were met. With his permission, they could trade their surplus in the town markets. Under communism, this system was perpetuated after Stalin's brutal collectivization as a means of stemming migration from farm to city. Now, whenever rumors circulate, as they did in '74, that some agricultural reorganization will wipe out the plots, high officials quickly issue denials, eventually fearful that abrupt change would engender serious peasant resistance. In the Soviet era, private plots have provided a vital margin against poverty, not enough in themselves to bridge the large gap in living standards between city and countryside. They have meant the difference for many families between bare subsistence and something better. For if you follow the farm folk, after they sell their produce, they head for Moscow shops to buy what is unobtainable in their grim little country stores. The Fortunate Georgians, Uzbeks, or Azerbaijanis from the south who grow high-priced tropical fruits and flowers or winter vegetables go off to bribe salesgirls for deficitny goods, buy toys and trinkets for children, splurge at restaurants, or occasionally pick up second-hand cars. But those from the stingy soils of central Russia, whose harvest is cheap potatoes, carrots, or beets, head for state stores to stock up on great long sausages and cold cuts, or to purchase thick winter stockings, heavy cloth overcoats, or aluminum pots and pans. Follow the country folk toward home at night in the railroad stations, and you see what Russians call the narod, the masses of whom officialdom and intellectuals privately speak with condescension or contempt. They are coarse, raw, simple people, weather-beaten as the log cabins in which they live, hardy and enduring as Maine fishermen, toughened by a lifetime of battling the elements. I remember one evening walking through Kazan Station, one of 9 stations that funnel more than 1 million travelers through Moscow daily. At 11 p.m., the waiting room was overflowing with a couple of thousand people. Every available seat was taken. Men lay on tables and floors trying to sleep. The whole sea of humanity reflected a niggardly, strenuous existence, the cheerless expressions, the rough apparel, the meager belongings, the subdued demeanor, the long wait. Russians often brag about how much they read, but I saw only a half a dozen people glancing at newspapers. The peasant women with broad, flat faces and cheeks, worn smooth as the wood of a well-used washboard, were sturdy as workhorses. They sat on benches like men, legs spread, hands clasped around their bellies, not a trace of femininity about them. The contours of their bodies were lost under layers of faded, shapeless clothing. I studied one old crone. Under her frayed black velvet vest jacket was a gray wool sweater, under that an ankle-length housecoat in a flowered print, under that another sweater, a calico dress, and so on. All had long since lost their color, for each garment had obviously been made to survive from harvest to harvest, like its wearer. The young teenage girls in bright jackets and plastic boots, or even soldiers in khaki, seemed colorful by comparison. The peasant men were silhouettes of darkness, dark rumpled, tieless jackets and pants, thick, dark, scratchy wool overcoats, dark workmen's caps or fur hats, black rubber boots or black shoes unshined for generations. Everywhere was improvised luggage, cheap cardboard suitcases, string bags stretched to accommodate impossible parcels, scavenged pieces of burlap or newspaper thrown around new belongings. As trains were called, people lumbered off with their awkward bundles. Follow the Narod into the countryside, and the modern world peels away with astonishing suddenness. Not only the peasantry, but the countryside presses in close around Moscow. It surprised me to see that just 10 miles from the Kremlin, near the village of Little Myshtikishi, city life and its modern conveniences simply come to an end. New apartment buildings give way to izbas, squat, low peasant log cabins. Side roads are suddenly no longer paved, but turned to dirt, often no more than 2 ruts or footpaths, dribbling off among garden fences. Thanks to Lenin's belief in electricity, most peasant homes have lights and television, but plumbing remains a luxury for the future. Each vegetable garden has its outhouse in the corner. Along the roadside, every few hundred yards, there is a hand pump and a well. In the soft warmth of summer or in the bitter cold of winter, I have watched country people crank up pails of water and then labor homeward with 2 buckets balanced carefully on a wooden shoulder yoke. Off the main highways, I have seen peasant women doing their wash by hand in the fresh, cold waters of country streams, with the onion domes of a church visible over the trees. In some villages outside Moscow, especially along the tourist route to the famous monastery of Zargorsk, about 60 miles to the north, peasant cabins have storybook decorations of carved, aqua-colored window frames. Their fences are neat and sturdy, and their villages have a fairly prosperous look. But much of Russian village life is shabby, drab, untidy, and above all muddy, with a mud that immobilizes life and movement. In the non-black earth zone of north-central Russia, a region roughly as far north as Hudson Bay, and with an inhospitable climate to match, the writer Boris Mozhev lamented not long ago that village life is decaying, slowly disintegrating. He described what I myself have seen on drives north of Moscow, peasant cabins listing from neglect, and the unkempt pasture land slowly giving way to the returning underbrush. It is as if modern civilization radiated outward from the cities in concentric circles, and the further out, the fewer amenities, the harder the life. This is what I was told by Gennady, a chubby, fast-talking accountant who was born and educated in Leningrad, but worked at 3 different state farms outside the city. In the pecking order of Soviet socialism, state farms are considered a higher order than collective farms, which are theoretically voluntary associations, though withdrawal from them is exceedingly difficult. Both types can be very large, incorporating thousands of acres in several villages. State farms pay their workers a regular wage, whereas collective farms get a share of the communal harvest in cash and kind. The salaries of state farm workers are higher, and they get other social benefits, such as state housing, but they have much smaller private plots, and for that reason sometimes actually make less money than collective farmers, though they are cushioned against bad harvest by their fixed salaries. On the stronger, larger state farms, not far from Moscow or Leningrad, or those built for show, Gennady told me, conditions are better in every way. Stone buildings, separate apartments for each working family, a sewage system running water. This was the way it was on the first 2 state farms where I worked. They were each about an hour from Leningrad, but the 3rd state farm was further out, about 2 hours. It was a weak farm, wooden buildings. It lacked all convenience. No central heating system, no sewage system, no running water. The greatest problem on all three was the lack of meat. There was almost none. As far as other food goes, the closer to Leningrad, the more the stores were selling. The further from Leningrad, the less they were selling. That was the rule. Apples you could get, but oranges, tangerines only in Leningrad. His comments were confirmed by the few stops I made in country stores around Moscow, which offered only a scant selection of basic goods like brown bread, a couple of kinds of cheese, lard, canned fish, pears, a few dried staples, and very rarely bologna. Some also carried a few housewares and a skimpy skeleton of clothing. They were dreary shops, and neither the bulging shelves nor the cracker barrel warmth of the traditional American country store. Yet even the glimpse of rural life in central Russia left me unprepared for what I heard from Galina Rogozina, the petite blonde Kirov ballerina who married and later immigrated with Valery Panov. I saw chickens to eat for the first time 2 years ago when I came to Leningrad, 1970. Galina said she had grown up in the Ural Mountains about 800 miles east of Moscow, an industrial region off limits to foreigners. Galina thought the travel ban might have been imposed because the authorities did not want Westerners to see how poorly people lived in the Urals, though my presumption was that it was because of the defense installations and possibly because of nuclear accidents of the 60s, which some of my friends talked about. We never ate chicken, Galina recalled. When I expressed astonishment, she shoved a saucer with 2 little tangerines at me. This is only the 3rd time in my life I've eaten these. Meat used to be available about once a month in her Urals childhood. Even attending the excellent ballet school in Perm, she found things little better. Most of the year there was nothing fresh to eat, absolutely nothing in winter, and a few fresh vegetables in summer, she said. I remember that at 13 in 1963, every other girl in my class at ballet school had liver trouble. They would all get yellow. The water was terrible for drinking from all the industry there. My hair used to fall out. I think it was because of the water, because it has stopped now. Leningrad has good water. We could get milk, of course, but only in the mornings. If I came to the store after noon, they were out. This is a side of Russia that foreigners rarely see. I remember a Russian woman who married an American telling me that her greatest surprise in coming to America was to see how narrow was the gap in living standards between city and country compared to that same gap in Russia. Roughly 100 million people live in the Soviet countryside. It is as impossible to generalize about them as about Soviet youth, for the farmers from the southern Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, with year-round growing seasons and lucrative cash crops, are much better off than the peasants of central Russia. Everywhere, too, rural life has its hierarchy. The farm directors, chief agronomists, better paid tractor and combine drivers, accountants, and engineers who stand well above the milkmaids, cow herders, and ordinary unskilled field hands. It is these last and least skilled who constitute the opposite end of the social spectrum from the privileged class of party and government bosses with their special stores and chauffeured cars, and the actual state of their lives is just about as hard for the outsider to learn about as is the privileged life of the elite. Soviet authorities are extremely sensitive about the countryside and the impression it makes on Westerners, even in cities. When I would notice the old log cabin homes which have a certain rustic warmth next to the tasteless stamped from the mold prefab buildings, officials would quickly describe plans to demolish the old izbas. Stone, it seemed, was a symbol of modern construction, whereas wooden dwellings were deemed a shameful sign of underdevelopment. The izbas did not fit the self-image of the nation that proclaimed itself the vanguard of socialism in the countryside too. Peasants would emerge to protest against our taking pictures or jot down our license plate if we stopped by the roadside. The foreign ministry balked and stalled at requests to spend any length of time in the countryside. For 3 years I sought permission to go live on a state or collective farm for several days, to gather a well-rounded impression of rural living. I proposed harvest time because I presumed that it would be a high point of activity, and therefore the most flattering time, though I was willing to accept any season and any farm they chose. When the Virgin Lands region was having a record grain harvest, I asked to go there, but a foreign ministry official told me that people there were too busy, and besides, he said, the people there did not like what you wrote about Armenia. Among several articles on Armenia, I had done one about Armenian nationalist feelings that had irked authorities in Moscow. I said that I was surprised to hear that the New York Times had readers in the Virgin Lands, but this quip did not budge him. Like other foreigners, I was occasionally taken on brief, chaperoned tours to model farms, usually in southern places like Moldavia or Uzbekistan, where climate and soil not only made farming more productive than in central Russia, but made ordinary living easier. In the Hungary steppe in Central Asia, I was impressed by dramatic land reclamation projects, which had recovered tens of thousands of acres of land from semi-arid desert and now provided record crops of cotton. An engineer described how they had built 70-yard wide irrigation canals, a real feat of engineering, slashing through the dusty, dry earth, giving life to man and plant. Farm chairmen rattled off imposing statistics that incredibly made peasants sound richer than high-level government bureaucrats or senior scientists. With other reporters, I was taken to freshly whitewashed homesteads, where the master of the house was a hero of socialist labor, or some equally atypical specialist who gave away the game by warmly recalling previous visits by foreign delegations to his immaculate home, a museum piece with its lace curtains, overstuffed furniture, and large television set on the corner table. Occasionally I would meet some ordinary soul, but in the company of so many official onlookers and kibitzers that realistic conversation about everyday life was impossible. It was always, life is good, we have everything. Once in Armenia, a collective farm chairman was telling Bob Kaiser of the Washington Post and me that ordinary field hands averaged 350 to 450 rubles a month year-round, and was offering other figures so out of line with published Soviet statistics that we simply stopped taking notes. But he droned on. As we walked to his house, some matter detained him, and I used the occasion to slip off independently to have a word with a farmhand who told me he made 150 rubles a month at harvest time, and less out of season, and that without his private plot he could not make ends meet. But before we got into particulars, the chairman came rushing after me, broke off the conversation, shepherded me into his house, where he fed us a huge meal, well laced with his strong homemade grape vodka, and toast to Soviet-American relations. We never did get to tour the farm, see people at work, and talk to them. It was a pattern repeated often, the interrupted conversations, the enforced drinking, the close chaperoning, the lack of time to mix freely. Under Brezhnev, much has been done to raise rural living standards by raising government procurement prices for crops, reducing compulsory delivery quotas to the state, and increasing basic wages of collective farmers, though they still lag behind the national factory workers' average of 187 a month. As an anti-poverty measure to aid the poorest families, the government introduced a program in November of '74 to pay child support allowances of $15 monthly to families in which annual income fell below $800 per capita. Press articles indicated that most of the 12.5 million recipients would be from large rural families. Inflation of food prices in the farmers' market in recent years has also benefited collective farmers, especially those with the most lucrative cash crops. Indeed, their forays into Moscow to sell produce and then raid the stores to hoard up on meat, sausages, and clothing has produced jealousy among city dwellers. I heard urbanites complaining that their country cousins were better off because, even on lower pay, money went further in the countryside and they could raise their own food. A chemist told me of his surprise when he picked up a hitchhiking peasant in his car one day and discovered that the man had 3,000 rubles in the savings bank but no car. There is some evidence that average savings in rural areas may actually be higher than in cities. This reflects how little there is to buy in the countryside, for in spite of recent improvements, rural Russians remain second-class citizens. The most obvious indicator that they themselves feel this way is the great exodus from the land into the cities, 21 million people from 1959 through 70. Occasionally, such respected scholars as Viktor Denstev, the demographer, candidly acknowledged the extreme backwardness of everyday life in the countryside. The most humiliating stigma for decades has been the government's refusal to issue collective farmers the domestic passports possessed by other citizens. Technically, without them, the peasantry is almost as tied to the land as serfs used to be. Many are embittered by that, yet so many found ways to get around the problem, especially by sending their children somewhere else to register for their first passports at age 16, that the government finally promised in '75 to issue passports to peasants, but it is in no rush. The process will take until the end of '81. By any measure of living standards, income, schools, social life, welfare, health care, consumer goods, leisure outlets, transportation, rural people are worse off than city residents. Millions live at or below what would be the poverty level in any other industrialized nation, as the government tacitly acknowledged with the new child support program. From bits and pieces in the Soviet press, I sensed in rural Russia that same demoralizing, self-reinforcing combination of conditions found in American pockets of rural poverty, social stigma, poor schools, physical isolation, bad working conditions, low wages, poor morale, limited leisure, and chronic alcoholism. These are conditions that make rural poverty in Russia such a hardcore problem, passed from generation to generation, because the most able and energetic young people depart for the cities, leaving the less able and the elderly to man the farms. The rural syndrome sets in early and ends late in life. Rural pensions average 20 rubles a month, half the national average. rural children have about half as much chance of getting into day nurseries or kindergartens as urban workers' children. They have less protection against child labor, and their schools are notably inferior, as the press repeatedly points out, mainly because educated city people wriggle out of assignments as country teachers. Children from country schools are not stupid, Nadia, an experienced Moscow high school literature teacher told me, but there is no comparison between the education they get and what we give our children. They aren't taught anything. One of their 10th grade teachers would go into our 7th grade. Often they don't even read books themselves in the literature course. They just listen to the teachers read them and do textbook exercises. And though she did not say, sociological studies show they have far less chance of getting into university than urban children. When it comes to farm mechanization, Soviet movies and television newsreels always seem to show spanking new tractors or combine harvesters moving in perfect echelons through sunny, wind-blown fields of wheat or geometrically ordered rows of cotton. From the cab of a tractor, the typical feature film hero, with a careful smudge on one cheekbone, often a woman with a bandana round her hair, a firm set cheekbone, a firm set to her jaw, and her eye on an impossible quota declares, "What the party wants is impossible." Vasya, after this bad weather, but we have taken our socialist obligations and we will fulfill them for the motherland. Don't worry, we'll do it somehow. But as I drove at random through the countryside, I was usually struck by how much back-breaking farm labor is still done by hand. It is true that mechanization, irrigation, and industrial farming techniques are expanding. Nonetheless, my mind's eye has an indelible image from repeated occasions of a drab-brown field worked by women in heavy padded cotton jackets and boots, bent double over the earth, digging potatoes or heaving heads of cabbage into a flatbed trailer. In that scene, the only mechanization is the tractor hooked up to the flatbed truck for hauling the produce away. Or in Central Asia, I remember seeing children 12 or younger dragging canvas bags through rows of cotton, hand-picking the bolls that combines had missed, roughly 1/3 of the crop. These visual impressions were confirmed not only by the loudly trumpeted fall campaigns for city folk to go into the countryside to help harvest potato and other crops, but also by periodic complaints in the press. One sticks in my mind. In 1975, several mothers in Turkmenia complained to Pravda that schools had shut down for 3 months so children could help gather cotton. The mothers wanted to know why this took so long. Pravda, obviously anxious to bawl out the Farm Equipment Administration, a traditional bête noire of Soviet agriculture, answered candidly that this was because 1/5 of Turkmenia's farm machinery was down for repairs. Even more striking to me was the acknowledgement in print by V. Krashenko, an economist, that in 1970 more than 80% of work in the socialized farm sector was still done by hand, obviously a big reason why Russia still has 4 or 5 times as many people in farming as America. One major obstacle to mechanization is the fact that the most modern, mechanically oriented people, the young, are leaving the countryside to try to stem this human hemorrhaging. Farm managers save the best mechanical jobs for the young men and give them good pay. Some young men do remain, For in those fields where women were digging potatoes, I noticed that the lone tractor driver was always a man, and usually a young one. A tractor driver from April through October, the busy season, Gennady, the state farm accountant, told me, could earn as much as 250 rubles a month, working every day 14 to 15 hours with no days off. In other months, 80 to 100 rubles. For the young, however, pay is not the prime cause for drift into the cities. It is the ennui, the tobacco road, emptiness of village life where entertainment is sometimes no more than sitting on a bench outside the green fence that shuts in the vegetable plots and keeps out the rest of the world, and watching an occasional truck or car pass by. It is difficult for Americans with more than 100 million private cars, many of them pickup trucks or jalopies, of farm families to appreciate the sense of isolation in Russian villages. For sheer voice contact with the outside world, a state farm of 3,000 to 4,000 people, Gennady said, may have only a half-dozen telephones. In the main offices or in the homes of the top officials, a roadside hamlet may have none. In 1970, the Soviet Union had 11 million phones compared to 120 million in America. An emergency at night, Gennady said, requires tracking down some farm official to get him to open up the offices to call an ambulance, and then the phone network is not always reliable and ambulances take hours in coming. Travel can be a worse headache. In winter, people get closed in by snow. In spring, the coffee-colored mud gets deep enough to sink a big truck to its axles, and human movement comes to a halt, except on a few main roads. Out-of-the-way villages become isolated for weeks. Children cannot get to rural district schools. Even in good weather, travel is a burden. Driving through the countryside, I've been struck by the numbers of people gathered to wait at bus shelters or walking alone in the open country, anxiously flagging us down for a ride. When we picked them up, they spoke of an interminable wait and the irregularity of bus service. Alexander Ginsburg, a dissident banished to Tarusa, about 90 miles from Moscow, told me that only about half the scheduled buses from there actually ran if he hit it perfectly. It took a minimum of 3 hours to bring his child to Moscow to see a doctor because the one pediatrician in his region was away. Another family living in Moscow said they would get up at dawn to go visit rural friends 150 miles away and felt pleased to get there by dinner, traveling by bus all day. It is this cut-off, provincial feeling more than anything else that seems to drive out the young. I remember one fall Sunday afternoon in the small town of Pasanuari in Soviet Georgia, about 60 miles from Tbilisi. Time hung over that hill town in the Caucasus with a dead weight, as it does in American Appalachia. The village elders had gathered for a funeral and talked idly in knots along the main road. A boy scampered past several houses, showing neighbors the fox he had trapped. At the in-tourist guest house, serving tourist traffic to the mountains, a cow clambered up the front steps, and a waiter had to chase her away 3 times. In the next block, women in dark shawls poked at a few Lenins in a sidewalk stall while others inspected a new shipment of dented aluminum pots in the general store. Beside a stone house, I fell into conversation with a square-jawed young Georgian worker who had quit the town and gone to Tbilisi, even though he lost money doing so. True, he said he made only 135 a month as a factory worker, and his father made twice that much doing carpentry and odd jobs in Passanuari, some official and some na levo. True too, he said, the sturdy stone homes of Passanuari village were more spacious than state apartments in Tbilisi, though they lacked plumbing. Also true, this being sunny Georgia, that when the orchards and vineyards yielded plenty of fruit and grapes for Georgian wine and cognac, some farmers could earn enough to buy a car, but in the factory, he said, brightening, you worked with machinery, but here with your hands. Tbilisi had restaurants and girls and things to do. It was modern. There's nothing to do here, no way to amuse yourself, he said, glumly. Then, gazing up at the leafless trees and long lines of burnished hills on either side of the valley, he added, there's no movie theater, nothing to do but hunt and drink. It was a tale I heard elsewhere. Gennady, an educated man in his early 30s, felt stir-crazy in the state farm villages around Leningrad. On a state farm, you have mud and impassable roads, and you walk around all the time in boots, he groaned. It's boring, such terrible boredom. And this is at a farm only a couple of hours from Leningrad. There is a club, an old wooden building, damp, cold, and besides, they show old films you've seen twice or 4 times. Everyone is, as they said, pod etim de l'homme, drunk. Young people want to go to the movies in Leningrad, to go around the city, not in boots, but in shoes, just to feel yourself not an animal, but a human being. If you're in the city, you're a human being. Given such sentiments, it is remarkable that the exodus from the countryside has not been greater. This says something not only about administrative restrictions, but also about the conservatism of the Russian peasantry and their roots in the countryside. Yet leading writers of the current village school, like Fyodor Abramov and Boris Mozhev, who exalt the long-suffering moral character and evoke the hardships of the peasantry, write that many feel alienated from the land and that the earth has become orphaned. What they seem to mean is that the peasantry no longer feel attachment to communal fields. In less literary terms, party officials squawk that field hands work poorly on collective land and sneak off as much as a third of the time to work on their private plots. The party's response to this and other chronic problems of Soviet agriculture has been to pour immense investments into farming, roughly 150 billion in 71 through 5, especially into grand schemes that will promote large-scale industrial farming. In some ways, the increasing use of chemical fertilizers and modern irrigation techniques is paying off. Cotton output has reached record highs, and even in bad years, when Moscow had to shop for grain in America, the grain harvests are 10 to 15 million tons larger than they were under Khrushchev. Brezhnev's new departure in the mid-70s has been to promote formation of collective farm conglomerates that would put construction, animal husbandry, and various other tasks on a joint industrial basis. Brezhnev's second plank, similar to Khrushchev's Virgin Land Scheme, was to announce a 35 billion ruble program to revitalize the long-neglected farmlands of Central Russia. The non-Black Earth region, I was told by a journalist that this had been pushed by Russophiles, the pro-Russian ethnic faction among the Politburo, including Mikhail Solomenstev, Premier of the Russian Republic, and Agricultural Minister Dmitry Polensky. In the long run, both programs seem intended not only to industrialize farming, but to reduce the role of private plots. Largely unnoticed abroad, a small band of liberals and economic rationalists working on the basis of industrial reforms of the mid-60s, have tried the opposite tack. They have sought to decentralize agriculture and to revive the peasantry's attachment to the land by trying to use the principle of private plot incentives on collective farmland. Capitalism in socialist clothing was how one reformer privately described it to me. The idea was to turn over sizable tracts of state or collective land to farm links, small working units of 6 to 12 qualified specialists whose pay depended solely on harvest from their tract. According to this concept, which surfaced in the early 60s, the link would have machinery as well as land at its disposal, and thus have responsibility not only for land cultivation, but also for machinery maintenance, a perennial headache in the Soviet farm system, and always a serious factor in bad harvest years. In effect, each link was a small cooperative enterprise in itself. The theory was simple. If pay depended on results and the workforce was organized in small enough units, each individual could see the benefit of producing well, just as on a private plot. The main difference from the existing system was that normally collective farmhands move all over huge areas, working one field and one task one day, another field the next, having no sense of responsibility and no direct dependence on the results of their labor. A tractor driver, I was told, is paid by the size of the area he plows, so that it behooves him to plow rapidly and shallow furrows in order to cover more territory, even though the best crop yields require plowing more slowly, more carefully, and deeper into the soil. The same with weeding and other tasks. The link was supposed to combat this quota-filling mentality. One celebrated exemplar of this system was Vladimir Porvitzky, a hero of socialist labor from the Krasnodar region, who showed in one experiment that his 10-man link could triple the yield of a tract normally worked at various times by 80 people. His link plowed, planted, weeded, reaped, and protected their land better than normal workers. They came to feel it was their land. I was told by Alexander Yanov, a former Soviet journalist who was forced to emigrate by the secret police because the reformism of his press articles had gone too far. I met Yanov in New York City in December of '74, 2 days after he left Moscow. The link idea was supported well enough during the mid-60s to gain token acceptance on many farms, with 1 or 2 small links on each very large farm, though it encountered opposition from both farm administrators and ordinary workers who, according to Yanov, saw themselves becoming superfluous if the smaller links proved too efficient. It would expose the gross overstaffing of most state and collective farms. Gradually, the Politburo, sponsor of the links scheme, Gennady Voronov, lost power and conservatives neutralized the link experiment. Nonetheless, Yanov told me of another reformer of unusual energy and daring who made a fresh attempt in the early 70s to put the link system with its built-in profit motive on an even larger scale. He was Ivan Kadenko, a burly, red-faced, outspoken veteran communist who resigned as a senior agricultural official of the Kazakh Republic in the 1960s in order to pursue his radical experiments. According to Yanov, Nikita Khrushchev was toying with using some of Kadenko's ideas to reform Soviet agriculture when he was overthrown in October of '64, yet Kadenko's efforts were so little known publicly that they were news to me when Yanov mentioned them in New York. Kadenko was Yanov's idol, a model for Soviet reform. We thought the link system, especially Kadenko's approach to it, would be the salvation of Russian agriculture, enthused Yanov, who wrote many articles on farming and other economic topics for Soviet newspapers and journals. We thought it would change the face of Russia completely. After one abortive experiment on a collective farm, Kadenko persuaded a state farm director to let him use a large tract of marginal, unused farmland in the hills around Akshi in Kazakhstan. He wanted to test whether a limited group of farm specialists would show greater productivity than normal state farm workers if they operated on the link principle, with tractors and materials for building their own homes borrowed from the parent state farm. Kadenko and his 60 picked specialists conducted their experiment in 72, a disastrous farm year for the Russians. Kadenko's idea was that with the link system on this larger scale, he could compete with the best farm enterprises in America and Western Europe. He not only said it, but he proved it, Yanov told me. Unfortunately, the experiment lasted for only one harvest, and then it became clear that if Kadenko was right, the entire agricultural leadership was wrong. The experiment was a success. They demonstrated that labor productivity on this farm was 20 times higher than on neighboring farms. The Kazakhs were so pleased that a local journalist wrote a play about Kadenko. It had its final inspection preview for a select audience on January 7th of 73. The preview was attended not only by censors, but a number of reform-minded journalists and economists like Abel Agambegian, director of the Institute of Economics at Novosibirsk, an internationally known advocate of more modern methods for Soviet planning. The next day, Kadenko was arrested and charged with trying to steal 1,000 rubles from the state, Yanov bitterly recalled. It was a trumped-up charge. The agricultural powers in Moscow were against the experiment. It appeared that Kadenko had been framed in a bureaucratic maneuver. The decree closing down his experimental farm at Akshi was signed by the Minister of Agriculture in Moscow, but Kadenko claimed that this was an incorrect procedure because such action required a decision by the entire Council of Ministers, and he went to court to sue for 11 months back pay for himself and his 60 men. A local court in Kazakhstan upheld his suit, actually exceeding its authority, though Kadenko did not know that, for when he took the court order to a bank to collect the funds, Yanov said he was arrested on charges of trying to obtain state funds under false pretenses. According to Yanov, there was high-level, behind-the-scenes intervention at Kadenko's trial, and the judge thought to be leaning toward Kadenko until the last moment, handed down a verdict against him and two of his closest aides. Kadenko was sentenced to 6 years in jail, although economists and scholars in important institutes in Moscow sympathized with Kadenko's efforts, and friends like Yanov tried to rally support for him. Very little was done to defend him. The leadership had rejected his approach, which would have put Soviet farming on a more flexible, pragmatic basis, and had decided to push ahead with a more centralized, industrialized program for upgrading Soviet agriculture. Kadenko died in prison in 74 at the age of 62.